When it comes to international politics, there is no denying that the USA's history of world policing and intervening in foreign affairs has been at the center of many political debates. And nothing has sparked these debates about American world policing more in recent times than America's recent controversial interventions in the Middle East under the claim of fighting terrorists and dictators in the region. These recent controversial interventions in the region have not just been at the center of political debates, but also dozens of conspiracy theories that have been spread rapidly on the internet which demonize the US government and make its reasons for intervening in the region look more sinister. Ranging from conspiracy theories about 9/11 being a false flag, to conspiracy theories about Osama bin Laden's footage being faked, to theories about chemical attacks in Syria also being false flag operations, or Rothschild centralized banks being behind these wars. And of course, you can't have conspiracy theories on the internet without your typical anti-Zionists and anti-Semites blaming Zionist Jews for everything in the world that they don't like, and forming their own conspiratorial takes that demonize Jews and Israel. One common example of this is none other than the Greater Israel Conspiracy Theory. The Greater Israel Conspiracy Theory is basically the belief that all of these wars in the Middle East are all secretly part of a Zionist plot to destabilize the region so that Israel can annex a huge chunk of the Middle East from Egypt all the way to Iraq and become a dominant state in the region. The theory basically goes that Zionists and Israel are both secretly orchestrating wars for the West to intervene in so that Israel can accomplish the state that is being shown on the screen, and that no peace will ever be known until Zionists accomplish this very map. This is a conspiracy theory that you will constantly see being spread online by pretty much all types of fringe groups who are anti-Zionist and anti-Western. And they will use this conspiracy as a very simplistic explanation as to why there are wars in the Middle East and why Western countries are getting involved in these conflicts. Now, before I explain why this conspiracy is bullshit, it is very important to remember that not all Zionists are the same. Regardless of what your views on the Israeli/Palestinian conflict are, you also have to acknowledge that Zionists are not a monolith. Zionism as defined is supposed to be the belief that Jewish people should have their own nation, and it only exists because of all the oppression that Jewish people have gone through throughout all of human history. Not every Zionist has the same views on certain issues the same way how not every Palestine supporter has the same views on certain issues. Some Zionists are liberal, some are conservative. Some are religious, or secular, or traditional, or progressive. Now, with all of that in mind, yes, there are some supremacist and fanatical Zionists out there who may want Israel to expand its borders and annex more territory. But it is also important to remember, as I just stated, that Zionists are not a monolith, and along with the fact that expansionist fanatics exist in almost every country in the world, not just Israel. If you take your time to do some research on extremist nationalists all across the world, you will find that these types of expansionist fantasies exist everywhere. There's a Greater Russia, there's a Greater China, Greater Persia, Greater Syria, Greater India, Greater Mexico, Greater Japan, Greater Mongolia, Greater Turkey, Greater Finland, Greater Greece, and a Greater Poland. Usually these expansionist fanatics are a small extreme minority who are mostly condemned by their countries and who have little to no influence at all in achieving their nationalistic fantasies. The idea of Israel annexing this much territory to achieve this much land shouldn't scare you any more than the idea of Mexico invading and retaking the southern states in America, or Mongolia bringing back the Mongolian Empire. Such people with such expansionist beliefs are nothing more than an extreme minority. Now, I'm sure there are some people who would try to argue that Israel is a country with expansionist ambitions and therefore we should be worried because Israel will stop at nothing to annex Arab land. The problem with this claim, however, is that there is no evidence that shows that Israel wants to annex more territory from Arab countries. Yes, there are some Israeli politicians who want to annex the West Bank and Gaza, but the vast majority of Zionists are not aiming to accomplish a greater Israel. Furthermore, this entire claim about Israel being expansionist completely falls apart when you consider the fact that Israel also has a history of giving land back to its Arab neighbors to make peace with them, such as when they gave the entire Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt in order to make peace with the Egyptians. If Israel was as expansionist as this conspiracy tries to make it out to be, then Israel would have never given that much land back to its neighbor to make peace with them. Another major problem with this conspiracy theory is that Israel wouldn't even need or be able to afford this much land. Keep in mind that there are around 14 million Jews in the world, and just 6 million to 7 million of them alone live in Israel. If every single Jewish person in the world moved to Israel, they wouldn't even need half of the territory in this map to host that much of the population, and not to mention that it wouldn't even be enough to displace the Arab population of all these countries. And not to mention that the Israeli government and military aren't crazy or stupid enough to ever try defending the ludicrous borders that we are seeing on this map. Israel is a small country with a very thin strip of land. They would never be able to afford defending that much territory and borders. Another reason why this conspiracy theory about Greater Israel is bullshit is because it doesn't really give a logical explanation as to why we have wars that the US has intervened in. Many conspiracy theorists often like to argue that Zionism is behind America's foreign policy and that the only reason why America has taken up the role of being the world's policeman is just so it can further the interests of Israel and Jewish people. The problem with this argument, however, is that most of the conflicts that the United States has been involved in since the end of World War II have had nothing to do with Zionism. Most of America's enemies since the end of World War II have not been a threat to Israel. I mean, if Zionism and Israel are behind American world policing and American-involved conflicts, then what did Zionism have to do with the wars that have happened in Vietnam, or Korea, or Afghanistan, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Ukraine, Cuba, Panama, Nicaragua, Greece, the Philippines, the Balkans, Laos, Congo, Angola, or Haiti? All of these countries have had or are currently having wars that the West has intervened in, and I don't recall any of these countries being a threat to Israel. Let us also not forget America's rivalry with China, North Korea, Venezuela, and Cuba. And I'm pretty sure these countries aren't a threat to Israel either. Now, of course, a lot of people will point at Iran as a threat to Israel and may use that as proof of Zionism running US foreign policy. However, Iran is also considered a threat to other countries in the Middle East, not just Israel. And not to mention that there are other factors that contribute to America's rivalry with Iran, such as the Iranian government's intention to dominate the region, the 1979 Islamic Revolution followed by the embassy hostage crises, and Iran's sponsoring of militia groups in the region to spread their influence and presence, and their growing alliance with Russia, Syria, and China against the West. Just simply claiming the cause of America's rivalry with Iran is because of Zionism is very simplistic and ignores all other factors that cause this rivalry. It is the equivalent of claiming that the only reason World War I happened was because of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand while ignoring all other factors that contributed to the war happening. Always keep in mind that when it comes to geopolitics there are no simplistic explanations to certain issues that can just easily be explained in less than 1 minute. Geopolitics is way more complex than that. However, there is one more main reason why these conspiracy theories about Greater Israel are trash. And that main reason being that this Greater Israel map is not really Greater Israel. Let me rephrase that. This supposed map of Greater Israel is fake and completely exaggerated. This is not the Greater Israel map. It is nothing but a fabrication that represents a certain scripture from the Bible. When I took the time to do some research on this map and to see where it originated from, I came across an article by Daniel Pipes where he analyzed the conspiracy theory and explained its origin. In his analysis, he found that this entire fake and exaggerated map represents the Bible scripture Genesis 15:18, where God tells Abraham that he's giving the land from the river of Egypt to the river of Euphrates. However, there are literally no Zionists from any point in history that has ever actually aimed at annexing this much land. The real Greater Israel that I am currently showing on the screen, that has only been advocated for by revisionist Zionists, only includes Jordan, not half of the Arab world. As Daniel Pipes even points out in his own article, This entire fake and exaggerated map is nothing more than anti-Israel propaganda that originated from Arab dictators during the 20th century to demonize the state of Israel and to justify wanting to eradicate it. And this entire theory was popularized in the late 1980s by Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, who based his entire theory off of the design of the Israeli 10 agora coin, while ignoring the fact that the coin is supposed to be a replica of a coin from 37 BCE, and that the supposed map we see on the coin is nothing more than the irregular shape of the ancient coin. This entire fake map of Greater Israel was literally just made up by Islamists and dictators in the Middle East to demonize the Israeli state in propaganda. And the dictators responsible for creating such a fabricated map include King Abdul Aziz bin Saud of Saudi Arabia, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Muammar al-Gaddafi of Libya, and Ruhollah Khomeini of Iran. Another thing that further proves that this map is fake is the fact that there are often different versions of this map that feature different territories and different versions of what's supposedly going to happen to the Arab populations of the region. As Daniel Pipes even further points out in his article, there have been different versions of the conspiracy that have been interpreted and promoted by Middle Eastern dictators and propagandists. For example, in Gaddafi's interpretation of Greater Israel, he claims that Greater Israel is a conspiracy to destroy the entire Muslim world by occupying all the land from Pakistan to Spain and from Turkey to Yemen, which is arguably the largest interpretation anyone has ever made of Greater Israel. Whereas in Syria, the Syrian radio station known as Radio Damascus interpreted Greater Israel during the 80s as only being double the size of Israel, while the Syrian Prime Minister that same decade interpreted it as including the entire Middle East along with Turkey, Iran, and parts of Africa. Furthermore, there are also contradictions made about how Arabs will be treated under Greater Israel. Sometimes the conspiracy goes that Arabs will be dominated and exploited, or sometimes it goes that they will be expelled so that Greater Israel becomes a place where only Jews can live. Due to all of the amounts of contradictions and different versions of this Greater Israel conspiracy theory that have been made in the Middle East, it becomes pretty obvious that the entire thing is all just a hoax to justify hatred against Jewish people. Nothing about this conspiracy theory is rational or helps to understand the conflicts in the Middle East. It's all just a simplistic scapegoat that you will find anti-Semites sharing online because it helps them feel enlightened about the Middle East. Whenever it comes to conspiracy theories about wars, somewhere on the internet you will find anti-Semitic talking points similar to this conspiracy that just blame Jewish people for the conflicts. Whenever you see a conspiracy theory like this one, always remember to remain skeptical and to take your time to do some actual research, because chances are at the end of the day that the entire conspiracy theory is most likely full of shit. Anyways, that's it with this video, and if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe for more anti-conspiracy theorist content. Thanks for watching.